At war with the Dharma. There's a depressing pattern in human behavior that Mark Twain noted more than a century ago, and it's with us still. The powers that be want a war. Politicians and the media start beating the drum, denouncing the evil intentions of the enemy and calling for all patriotic citizens to attack them. At first, people are reluctant to go along, but then religious leaders jump on the bandwagon, telling their followers that it's their sacred moral duty to support the war machine. Soon the whole country is aflame with the moral need to fight the enemy. Those few who question this need are branded as traitors. Young men march off to battle, only to find how ghastly war actually is. They realize that they were duped and that their side is not as virtuous as they had been led to believe. Many of them are killed. Those lucky enough to return home tell their families and neighbors, never again will they be tricked into going to war ever again. But then, after a while, the powers that be want another war. Politicians and the media start beating the drum. If the arguments for the last war no longer work, they find new ways of raising the emotional pitch of their rhetoric so that soon the whole country is swept up in war fever all over again. The only way to keep yourself from getting sucked into this pattern is to have strong principles against killing, principles you hold to no matter what. This is one of the reasons why the Buddha formulated the precept against killing in the most uncompromising way. Don't intentionally kill anything or anyone, ever. Don't tell other people to kill, and don't condone the act of killing. SN 214. When asked if there were anything at all whose killing he would approve of, the Buddha answered with just one thing: anger. SN 171. That's as clear-cut and absolute as you can get, and it's clear-cut for a reason. Clear-cut rules are easy to remember even when your emotional level is high, and that's precisely when you need them most. If you approach every argument for war with this precept in mind, then no matter what reasons people might cite for supporting the war, you protect yourself by always putting the precept first. If you leave room in your mind for exceptions to the precept, someone will find a way to exploit those exceptions, and you'll be back where you were before you had the precept, fooled into supporting another war. The precepts are like a fence around your property. If there's a gap in the fence, anything that can fit into the gap, or enlarge it by wriggling through, will be able to get in. It'll be as if there weren't a fence there at all. Now, it's important to remember that the Buddha never forced the precepts on anyone. Instead of calling them obligations, he called them training rules, and the training is something you take on voluntarily. Your moral behavior is a voluntary gift of safety to the world. If you can make that gift universal, with no exceptions, you can have a share in universal safety as well. And 839. If you actually break a precept, the safe course of action is not to try to redesign the training to justify what you've done. Instead, you honestly admit that your training has lapsed and do your best to get back on course. Given that the texts are so clear and unequivocal on the issue of killing, it's hard to conceive that anyone would even think of trying to formulate a Buddhist theory of just war. Yet there have been such attempts in the past, and they're with us again now. If we have any concern for the Dharma at all, it's important to reject these theories outright. Otherwise, we find ourselves quibbling over when and where it's right to issue a Buddhist license to kill. And no matter how strictly we try to restrict the license, it's like running a tank through the back of our fence and putting up a sign next to the resulting hole, saying that only those thieves and bears who promise to behave themselves nicely will be allowed to enter, and then leaving them to police themselves. Because the early texts rule out killing in all circumstances, attempts to formulate a Buddhist just war theory ultimately have to fall back on one basic assertion: there's something wrong with the texts. Because this assertion can take many forms, it's useful to examine a few of them, to see how misleading they can be. That way, we won't fall for them. The big one is this: the moral ideals expressed in the early texts may be inspiring, but they offer no practical guidance for dealing with the complexities of real life. Real life presents situations in which holding strictly to the precepts would entail loss. Real life contains conflicting moral claims. The texts recognize none of these issues. They teach us no way of dealing with evil aggressors, aside from passivity and appeasement, hoping that our loving-kindness meditation will inspire in the aggressors a change of heart. So on this issue, we can't trust that following the texts will protect us. Actually, the early texts are not silent on issues of moral complexity. They do answer questions about the losses that can come from holding to the precepts and about the desire to meet obligations at odds with the precepts. It's just that their answers aren't the ones we might want to hear. Of course, these answers are based on the teaching of karma and its effect on rebirth, teachings that many modern Buddhists view with skepticism. But the Buddha dealt with skeptics in his own day. As he told them, no one can really know the truth of these teachings until awakening, but if you take them on as working hypotheses in the meantime, you're more likely to be careful in your behavior than if you didn't. 60. If it turns out that they're not true, at least you can die with a clear conscience, knowing that you've lived a pure life free from hostility or ill will. When you discover that they are true, you'll be glad that you kept yourself safe in 366. The Buddha readily acknowledged that there are times when following the precepts will put you at a disadvantage in terms of the world. You might lose your wealth, your health, or even your relatives. But those losses, he says, are minor in the long run. Major loss would be to lose your virtue or to lose right view. Those losses could harm you for many lifetimes to come. Here the lesson is obvious. For the sake of your long-term benefit, be willing to suffer the lesser losses to keep from suffering the major ones, and 5 to 130. At the same time, there are many occasions when breaking a precept brings short-term rewards in this world, but from that fact, the Buddha never drew the conclusion that those rewards justified breaking the precept. SN 42:13. As for conflicting obligations, the texts tell of the case of a person who, finding that he's about to be thrown into hell for breaking the precepts, pleads with the hell wardens for leniency. He broke the precepts because of his social obligations to family, friends, or king. Does he get any leniency? No. The hell wardens throw him into hell even as he's making his plea. MN 97. The Buddha said that if you want to help others, you can provide them with food, clothing, shelter, or medicine as needed. Better yet, you get them to follow the precepts too, and 499. By this token, if you tell others that there are times when it's their moral duty to break the precepts, you're actually working for their harm. If they act on your recommendation and are thrown into hell, will you be on hand to plead their case? And will the hell wardens give you a hearing? So when the texts tell us to stick with the precepts in all cases, they're actually teaching us how to protect our long-term well-being. This doesn't mean that the precepts leave you totally defenseless against an enemy, just that they force you to think outside the box. If you're determined not to kill under any circumstances, that determination forces you to think in more creative ways to keep an adversary from taking advantage of you. You learn methods of self-defense that fall short of killing. You put more store in diplomacy and don't look down on intelligent compromise. The ideals of the texts are for those who want to go straight to liberation undeterred. They are the ones who should hold to the precepts no matter what, even being willing to die rather than to kill. However, there has to be guidance for those who want to take the longer road to liberation through many lifetimes, at the same time fulfilling their social obligations, such as the duty to kill in defense of their country. Actually, the early texts do describe a slow route to liberation, and a prime feature of that route is holding to the precepts in all situations, and 854. Don't do anything that would land you in the lower realms. By this standard, it's hard to see how an even slower route, one that allowed for theories of just war, would count as a route to liberation at all. As the Buddha pointed out, if you're in battle with the enemy, trying to kill them, your mind is immersed in ill will. If you get killed at that point, your mind state would take you to hell. If you have the wrong view that what you're doing is virtuous, you can go either to hell or to rebirth as an animal, SN 42-3. Neither of these destinations lies in the direction of Nibbana. It would be like flying from Las Vegas to San Diego via Yemen, with a long layover in Afghanistan, during which you'd probably forget where you were going to begin with. The texts are obsessed with the letter of the precepts, but it's important not to let the letter get in the way of their spirit, which is to cause the least harm for the greatest number of people. Sometimes you have to kill people to prevent them from doing greater harm. This spirit is never expressed in the texts, and for good reason. It assumes that there's a clear way of calculating when doing a lesser evil will prevent a greater evil, but what clear boundary determines what does and doesn't go into the calculus? Can you discount the retaliation that will come from people who want to avenge your lesser evil? Can you discount the people who take you as an example in committing their own ideas of what constitutes a lesser evil? How many generations or lifetimes do you take into account? You can't really control the indirect effects of your action once it's done. You can't tell for sure whether the killing you do will result in more or less killing than what you're trying to prevent. But what is for sure is that you've used your own body or your own speech in giving orders, things over which you do have control, to kill. A principle that's actually closer to the precepts and allows for no misapplication is that you never use other people's misbehavior as justification for your own. No matter what other people do, you stick to the precepts. Maybe the texts are hiding something. Maybe the Buddha didn't intend the precepts to be taken as absolutes. There must have been times when kings came to consult with him on when war might be morally justified, but for some reason the texts never tell us what he said. This conspiracy theory is probably the most dangerous argument of all. Once it's admitted as valid, you can turn the Dharma into anything you want. I personally find it hard to believe that, after painting the picture of the soldier destined for hell when dying in battle, the Buddha would have privately discussed with King Pasenyudi the grounds on which, for reasons of state, he could rightly send people into that situation. The texts tell us that he once told Pasenyudi that if you break the precepts, then no matter how large your army, you leave yourself unprotected. If you keep the precepts, then even if you have no army at all, you're well protected from within. It's in 3-5. Was this teaching meant just for public consumption? Are we to assume that the Buddha was a two-faced Buddha who taught a secret doctrine to kings so completely at odds with what he taught in public? The Buddha had so many chances to make exceptions to the precept against killing, but he always stuck by his principles, no intentional taking of life, period. When you try to cast doubt on these principles, you're working for the harm of many, leaving them unprotected when they try to determine what should and shouldn't be done. And 362. That's much worse than leaving them without a license to kill an aggressor, no matter how bad. Free the Dhamma. The Sutta Nipata, an early collection of poetry in the Pali Canon, contains a dramatic discourse, SN 1-4, in which a wealthy Brahmin farmer chides the Buddha for not farming. If he were to farm, the Brahmin argues, he wouldn't have to go for alms. This was a typical Brahmanical criticism of the Buddhist monks in that day. If they want to eat, they should work rather than go begging for food. The Buddha, however, responds that he too, in his way, is a farmer. The Brahmin then questions him in verse. What kind of farming does he do? The fact that the question is in verse is a challenge. To properly answer it, the Buddha has to compose verses on the spot in the same meter as the Brahmin's question. The Buddha more than meets the challenge, reciting extemporaneous verses on how the qualities of mind developed in Dhamma practice correspond to different farming skills and implements, yielding the highest fruit, the deathless. The Brahmin, impressed by the Buddha's virtuosity, offers him a bowl of milk rice as a payment for his skill in teaching the Dhamma. But the Buddha rejects the rice, saying that he can't accept such a payment. He then advises the Brahmin to throw the rice away on a spot where there's no vegetation or into water where there are no living beings. The Brahmin drops the rice into water where there are no living beings, and in the words of the discourse, just as an iron ball heated all day, when tossed in the water, hisses and sizzles, seethes and steams, in the same way the milk rice, when dropped in the water, hissed and sizzled, seethed and steamed. The Brahmin, in awe, his hair standing on end, goes to the Buddha and throws himself at his feet, asking to take refuge in the triple gem and to be accepted into the Sangha as a monk. In no long time, we're told, he becomes an arhat. The drama of this incident makes it hard to miss the point. The Buddha saw any payment for teaching the Dhamma as unacceptable. Another discourse in the canon, and 5-159, shows that this principle applied not only to him personally. When learning that one of his monk disciples is teaching the Dhamma, the Buddha lays out 5 conditions for how Dhamma should be taught, one of them being, the Dhamma should be taught with the thought, I will speak not for the purpose of material reward. So the Buddha was very clear on this point, It's inappropriate for a monk or nun to accept payment for teaching the Dhamma, or for anyone to teach the Dhamma for the purpose of material reward. The image of the milk rice hissing and sizzling, seething and steaming, sears this message into the mind, which raises the question, what about Dhamma books, should they not be sold? The canon doesn't answer this question directly, because there were no Dhamma books when the Buddha taught or the canon was assembled. Dhamma texts were memorized because, given the rigorous training in memorization that was perfected in ancient India, it was felt that the person-to-person communication of the Dhamma was more reliable than copying the Dhamma out in writing. A few centuries later, though, attitudes changed, as some texts almost disappeared during wars in which many of those who had memorized the texts were put to the sword. So people began writing the Dhamma down in the form of manuscripts and books. At that time, those who wrote and received these written texts seem to have kept the above two passages in mind. A Dhamma book was deserving of special respect. The commentaries to the Pali Canon, for instance, list Dhamma books as a type of memorial, on a par with memorials containing the Buddha's relics. For this reason, some of the earliest written Dhamma works state that they should be bowed down to. Even today in Asia, there's a strong etiquette around how Dhamma books should not be placed on the floor or stepped over. When stored, they should be stored above the head. A book may be an object, but a Dhamma book should be treated as the Dhamma itself. However, there was the question of whether the scribes who copied Dhamma books should be paid. The general attitude seems to be that professional lay scribes could be paid, but that monks and nuns, in line with the principle stated in 5 to 159, should not. An additional change came more recently as printing presses came to Theravada lands, and Dhamma books were mass-produced. In some cases, the printing presses belonged to the monasteries themselves. To cover their costs, the monasteries began putting a price on the books they printed. This trend brought about a counter-trend, those who insisted that Dhamma books shouldn't be treated like merchandise in the market. Lay printers could be paid to print Dhamma books according to this view, but once printed, the books should be freely given away. This would provide those who sponsored such books the opportunity to engage in the highest form of giving, the gift of Dhamma, DHP 354. It would also provide the recipients of such books the heartwarming opportunity to be recipients of a gift of Dhamma, and not just purchasers of Dhamma merchandise. In Thailand, this latter view has been most forcefully asserted by Ajahns in the forest tradition. In the rare cases where communities in this tradition have consented to have their books printed for sale, they have never argued that they were doing so in light of anything the Buddha did or said. It was simply for the pragmatic purpose of getting the Dhamma to as many people as possible, and was seen as a concession to the degenerate times in which we live. Even the monks and lay people outside of the forest tradition who sell Dhamma books have never tried to cite the Buddha as their authority for selling their books. Their rationale has been straightforwardly pragmatic. They couldn't afford to print Dhamma books otherwise. However, now that the Dhamma has come to the West, entrepreneurs who sell Dhamma books have become more aggressive in their reasoning as to why there's nothing wrong with what they are doing. Some have actually cited passages from the Pali Canon that, according to them, show that the Buddha himself would have approved of the practice. This, they say, shows that those who criticize the practice of selling Dhamma books are actually arguing in opposition to the Dhamma. These arguments avoid mentioning the two passages cited above where the Buddha shows most clearly his attitude toward receiving payment for teaching the Dhamma. But it's good to keep in mind the image of the milk rice hissing and sizzling as we examine the three sets of reasoning offered by the apologists for the practice of slapping a price on the Dhamma and putting it up for sale. The first set of reasons are similar to the pragmatic reasons cited in Asia. You get more Dhamma to more people more effectively if you take advantage of the commercial book distribution network already in place here in the West than you do if you give your books away. People can more easily find books offered for sale than those for free distribution, and, because modern people have so little time to judge books for themselves, they can save time by trusting that books offered for sale have been peer-reviewed, and are thus more reliable than Dhamma books given away. The apologists then cite the Buddha as an authority in support of these considerations by quoting the passage from the Vinaya in which the Buddha first sent his Arahant disciples out to spread the Dhamma to as many people as possible. Then the Blessed One addressed the monks. I am released, monks, from all snares, human and divine. You too, monks, are also released from all snares, human and divine. Wander, monks, for the benefit and happiness of many, out of sympathy for the world, for the welfare, benefit, and happiness of devas and human beings. Don't any two of you go by the same way. MVI.11.1. Now, telling a group of arahants to teach many people is not the same as telling them to print and sell Dhamma books. The Buddha was not a sales manager willing to sacrifice his principles in order to meet quarterly goals. His desire to get the Dhamma to many people was balanced by his sense of fitting and right ways to do it. This point is especially clear when we look at his remarks to the Brahmin in SN 1-4. By rejecting the Brahmin's offer of milk rice, he risked offending him. And this was not the only instance in which he risked offending his listeners when taking a stand on what's fitting and right. SN 4-9 tells of another, when he rejected, with a few sharp words, another Brahmin's offer of his daughter. The Buddha had standards for when and to whom he would teach the Dhamma. That's why he formulated the Sakya rules in the Patimokkha concerning situations in which it is not proper to teach the Dhamma, all of which deal with situations in which the listener is not showing the proper respect. This means that the Buddha didn't regard his desire to spread the Dhamma far and wide as overriding questions of when it is appropriate or inappropriate to teach. And as SN 1-4 and 5-159 show, teaching the Dhamma for material reward was, in his eyes, inappropriate, so in situations like that, it shouldn't be taught. Which means that using MV.11.1 as an excuse for selling the Dhamma is simply taking it out of its larger context and, as a result, distorting its meaning. The rise of the Internet has meant that Dhamma books can be distributed widely across the world at no cost at all, so there's no reason to believe that books for sale are more easily obtained than books offered freely. As for the argument that books for sale can be trusted to have been peer-reviewed, there's always the question of what standards are being used by book publishers when they decide whether to print a book for sale. Even if we limit our attention to academic publishers, those least likely to print a book just because they anticipate a healthy profit, it's an indisputable fact that academic publishers have printed some pretty abominable books about the Buddhist teachings that have done a great deal to foster widespread misunderstandings about Dhamma. It's hard to imagine that the Buddha had these books in mind when he told the arahants to teach the Dhamma out of sympathy for the world. The second set of arguments draws on an incident reported in SN 3:13. King Pasenyudi of Kosala has been eating too much, and one day, right after a heavy meal, he comes to see the Buddha, breathing heavily. The Buddha senses that the king is overeating, so he recites this verse. For a person always mindful, knowing moderation in the food he's obtained, his pains grow slender. Gradually he ages, guarding his life. The king, pleased with the verse, turns to one of his courtiers, a young Brahmin named Sudassana, and tells him to learn the verse from the Buddha and then to recite it every day when the king is taking his meal. As a reward, he offers Sudassana a considerable stipend, a daily payment of 100 kahapanas. The Buddha teaches the verse to Sudassana. Sudassana recites it every day, and the king begins to restrict his intake of food. Ultimately, when he becomes quite slim, he exclaims over how the Buddha showed sympathy both for his benefit in this life and for his benefit in lives to come. The apologists for selling Dhamma books cite this passage as proof that the Buddha approved of people getting paid to teach the Dhamma. After all, he didn't object when Pasenyudi offered the stipend to Sudassana, and even taught the verse to Sudassana, knowing full well that Sudassana would get paid for reciting it. Ergo, the Buddha approved of the general principle that people be paid for teaching the Dhamma. This is a particularly tone-deaf interpretation of the sutta. To begin with, the Buddha was not so foolish as to interfere in the way the king ran his palace, telling the king how he should or shouldn't reward his lackeys. And that's what Sudassana is, the king's lackey. By accepting payment, Sudassana is affirming his servitude to the king. And of course, the king wouldn't pay Sudassana for reciting any passage of Dhamma that he didn't want to hear. He who pays the piper calls the tune. So the actual message of the passage is that if you accept payment for teaching the Dhamma, you're putting yourself in the position of a lackey, free to teach only what your audience is willing to buy. The third set of arguments takes the following passage as its jumping-off point. Monks, there are these two kinds of gifts, a gift of material things and a gift of the Dhamma. Of these two kinds of gifts, this is supreme, a gift of the Dhamma. ITI 98. Here the apologists, after noting the canonical distinction between gifts of material things and gifts of the Dhamma, and the superiority of the latter, come up with a novel way of interpreting the distinction when applied to Dhamma books. A book, they say, is not Dhamma. It's just a material thing, so giving a Dhamma book is a lower form of generosity. The actual gift of Dhamma occurs when one teaches the Dhamma. In the context of Dhamma writings, they claim, the actual gift occurs when a writer, without ulterior motive, puts the Dhamma into writing. Whether that Dhamma is then printed in a book for sale or in one offered for free distribution doesn't alter the fact that the superior gift of Dhamma has already been given. This argument is based on a bizarre misunderstanding of the act of giving. In reality, a gift doesn't become a gift until it's been given freely to a recipient. In a genuine gift of Dhamma, a teacher puts the Dhamma into words and freely conveys those words to a recipient. Until there's a recipient, there's no gift. And if the recipient has to pay for the words, there's certainly no gift. The mere act of writing the Dhamma doesn't count as a gift at all. The fact that people who make this third argument understand so little about something as basic as the act of giving raises the question of how they can be trusted to know anything else of the Dhamma. I've often been told that people in the West don't appreciate free books, and that they measure a book's value by its monetary price. So, to convince Westerners that Dhamma books are worthwhile, those books should have a price attached to them. Only then will Westerners want to read them. But surely, one of the purposes of spreading the Dhamma is to change people's attitudes, and in particular to get them to stop measuring value by monetary price. The best way to do that is to offer high-quality Dhamma books for free, as evidence that the price of an object is no indication of its quality, and that generosity is a heartwarming activity. I know of many people who initially regarded free Dhamma books with suspicion. As one person told me, she assumed that a free distribution book was worth what she paid for it, i.e., nothing, only to learn that some free Dhamma books were free because they were too valuable to have a price. The Buddha taught generosity as the bedrock of the practice. The best way to teach generosity is not to get someone to buy a book on the topic, but to practice generosity yourself, as when you give the Dhamma freely. When people have to pay for a Dhamma book, the fact that they can't get the book without paying for it places a barrier between them and the Dhamma on the one hand, and between them and the teacher on the other. When they obtain a Dhamma book as a gift, those barriers are torn down. Mindfulness to the fore. The meaning of param. The Pali Canon's descriptions of mindfulness of breathing start with a standard introduction. There's the case where a monk, having gone to the wilderness, to the shade of a tree, or to an empty building, sits down folding his legs crosswise, holding his body erect, and establishing mindfulness, param. Always mindful, he breathes in, mindful, he breathes out. The question is, what does param mean in this context? As it turns out, it's a controversial point. The suttas, or discourses, don't explain or define the term. A later text in the Abhidhamma, Vibhanga 12:1, interprets it as meaning the tip of the nose or the sign of the mouth, nasi caga va mukanamit va. According to the commentary to this passage, the sign of the mouth is the middle portion of the upper lip. The Vibhanga's interpretation of the word is a strictly literal one. If you take it apart into its root and prefix, Parai means around. Mukham means face or mouth. This would mean in practice that you should start breath meditation by establishing your mindfulness on the tip of the nose, on the upper lip, or around the mouth. However, this interpretation doesn't fit in with the way the suttas actually use the term param or other key words associated with meditation practice. In other words, even though the suttas don't explicitly define the word param, the ways they use the term, and the context in which they use it, show implicitly that neither tip of the nose, nor around the mouth would be the best meaning to adopt for the word. What's interesting is that the commentaries to the suttas and even to the Abhidhamma seem to note this fact. So, in what's a rare move for them, They differ from the Vibhanga on this point and offer their own interpretations of param, stating that it refers to the manner with which mindfulness is established in relation to its object, rather than the physical point where it's focused. In fact, when we look at the suttas, we'll see that the question of what spot in the body is ideal for focusing your awareness while doing breath meditation is a total non-issue. Instead, it seems that the commentaries are right in saying that param indicates the manner with which you establish mindfulness when you start meditating. However, even the commentaries' definitions for the term are not quite in line with the suttas. They indicate that param refers to the relationship between mindfulness and its object, whereas the suttas suggest that it refers to the relationship of mindfulness to other mental factors prior to choosing an object. It's meant to take the lead in the training of the mind. To understand this point, we have to look not only at how param is used in the suttas, but also at the meaning of two terms in the suttas that establish the context for understanding how it's used: Siddhasa Akagata and Sabaka Patisamvedi. Siddhasa Akagata. The first term, Siddhasa Akagata, is the sutta's standard definition of concentration. Now, some modern schools of meditation teach that concentration practice is radically separate from mindfulness practice, which would mean that because param describes mindfulness, the meaning of Siddhasa Akagata would have no bearing on what param means. But in the suttas, the relationship between mindfulness and concentration practice is very close. As the Buddha indicates again and again, the practice of right mindfulness is meant to lead straight to right concentration, as in 45:1. The four establishings of mindfulness, satipatthana, which are the definition of right mindfulness, are the themes of right concentration, MN 44, and 8:70. The fourth level of right concentration, the fourth jhana, is where mindfulness is purified, DN 2. And as we'll see below, the fourth jhana is where the fourth step in the Buddha's instructions for mindfulness of breathing is fully realized, and 438 and 1020. So, given that right concentration is where mindfulness practice is aimed, any understanding of mindfulness of breathing requires knowing the state of mind at which it's aimed. Siddhasa Akagata is another term that the suttas don't explicitly define. Modern scholars often translate it as one-pointedness of mind. Siddhasa obviously means of the mind. But there are good reasons for holding that one-pointedness is not the best translation for Akagata in this context. First, let's look at the parts of the compound. Ika means one, and ta is a suffix turning an adjective, in this case, a caga, into a noun. That much is uncontroversial. The issue is around aga, which many people translate as point. To begin with, aga has many other meanings besides point. In fact, it has two primary clusters of meanings, in neither of which is point the central focus. The first cluster centers on the fact that a summit of a mountain is called its aga. Clustered around this meaning are ideas of aga as the topmost part of something, such as the ridge of a roof, the tip of something, such as the tip of a blade of grass, and the best or supreme example of something, such as the Buddha as the aga of all beings. And 580 plays with these meanings of aga when it criticizes monks of the future who will search for the tip-top flavors, rasaga, with the tip of the tongue, jivhaga. The second cluster of meanings for aga centers on the idea of dwelling, meeting place, or gathering place. A hall where monks gather for the uposatha, for example, is called an uposathaga. The spot where they gather for their meals is called a bhattaga. So the question is whether aga in the context of concentration has a meaning closer to summit, and thus possibly point, or to gathering place. Here, the best guide is furnished by the similes the Buddha provides in various suttas, such as DN 2, MN 119, and N 528, for the four jhanas that constitute right concentration. The first jhana. Just as if a dexterous bathman or bathman's apprentice would pour bath powder into a brass basin and knead it together, sprinkling it again and again with water, so that his ball of bath powder, saturated, moisture-laden, permeated within and without, would nevertheless not drip. In the same way, the monk permeates and pervades, suffuses and fills this very body with the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. There is nothing of his entire body unpervaded by rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. The second jhana. Just like a lake with spring water welling up from within, having no inflow from the east, west, north, or south, and with the skies supplying abundant showers time and again, so that the cool fount of water welling up from within the lake would permeate and pervade, suffuse and fill it with cool waters, there being no part of the lake unpervaded by the cool waters. In the same way, the monk permeates and pervades, suffuses and fills this very body with the rapture and pleasure born of concentration. There is nothing of his entire body unpervaded by rapture and pleasure born of concentration. The third jhana. Just as in a lotus pond, some of the lotuses, born and growing in the water, stay immersed in the water and flourish without standing up out of the water, so that they are permeated and pervaded, suffused and filled with cool water from their roots to their tips, and nothing of those lotuses would be unpervaded with cool water. In the same way, the monk permeates and pervades, suffuses and fills this very body with the pleasure divested of rapture. There is nothing of his entire body unpervaded with pleasure divested of rapture. The fourth jhana. Just as if a man were sitting covered from head to foot with a white cloth, so that there would be no part of his body to which the white cloth did not extend, in the same way the monk sits, permeating the body with a pure, bright awareness. There is nothing of his entire body unpervaded by pure, bright awareness. Now, obviously these similes indicate that concentration is a full-body experience. Monk permeates and pervades, suffuses and fills this very body with the rapture and pleasure. There is nothing of his entire body unpervaded by rapture and pleasure. There is nothing of his entire body unpervaded by pure, bright awareness. If your awareness were restricted to a single point, you'd have no way of knowing whether rapture and or pleasure had pervaded the entire body in the first three jhanas, and your body certainly wouldn't be permeated with a pure, bright awareness in the fourth. There's an opposing interpretation here, stating that the word body in these similes doesn't mean the physical body, because a person in jhana has to be oblivious to the physical body aside from the one focal point of concentration. Instead, body is meant metaphorically as a term for the body of the mind. However, it's hard to understand why, if the Buddha really did mean for concentration to be a state of awareness restricted to a single point, the similes would have occurred to him in the first place as a useful or appropriate way of describing the jhanas. And it would call into question his skill as a teacher if, wanting to convey that jhana was an exclusively one-pointed concentration, he used these similes of fullness and extensiveness to describe such a narrow experience. But putting that question aside, we can simply note that in MN 119, the Buddha gives the similes for the jhanas immediately after his discussion of 6 ways of focusing on the physical body. If he had meant body to mean physical body in the first context, and mind-body in the discussion immediately following it, he would have signaled that he was redefining his terms, but he didn't. So unless we want to assume that the Buddha was careless or devious in his meditation instructions, it seems best to interpret aga in the compound akagata as meaning gathering place. All the factors of jhana are gathered around a single object or theme, but awareness embraces the entire body so that the body can be filled with pleasure, rapture, and a pure, bright awareness as these qualities are developed in the course of deepening concentration. Given that the state of concentration is said to be a dwelling, vihara, and that a person enters and dwells, viharati, in concentration, this meaning of aga seems to be the most appropriate for the context. Sabaka ptis. This then relates to the second term that establishes the context for param, sabaka ptis. This word appears in the third step of breath meditation instructions as listed in MN 118 and other places in the canon. It means sensitive to the entire body. 1. Breathing in long, he discerns, I am breathing in long, or breathing out long, he discerns, I am breathing out long. 2. Or breathing in short, he discerns, I am breathing in short, or breathing out short, he discerns, I am breathing out short. 3. He trains himself, I will breathe in sensitive to the entire body. He trains himself, I will breathe out sensitive to the entire body. 4. He trains himself, I will breathe in calming bodily fabrication. He trains himself, I will breathe out calming bodily fabrication. The question is, what does body mean in the phrase, sensitive to the entire body? Looking at this in terms of the similes for jhana, it would seem obvious that entire body here means the entire physical body. However, the Visuddhimagga 8.171, a commentarial text, insists that body in this compound cannot mean the physical body, and instead must mean the body of breath, and that the entire compound means being sensitive to the entire length of the breath. There are 3 reasons, though, for not accepting the Visuddhimagga's interpretation here. 1. The first is that these 4 steps for mindfulness of breathing appear in MN 119 in the context of other meditation practices, all of which focus on the physical body. If the Buddha had meant body to mean physical body in the context of those exercises, but something else here, he would have said so, but he didn't. 2. The second reason is that the Visuddhimagga's interpretation of step 3 in the Buddha's instructions makes it redundant with steps 1 and 2. It's hard to understand how you could discern whether the breath is long or short in those steps without being aware of the full length of the breath. 3. The third reason is that the Visuddhimagga's interpretation leaves a huge gap between steps 2 and 4. Step 4, as the above passage shows, is to train yourself to breathe in and out, calming bodily fabrication. Now, N438 and N1020 explain what this means. And how is a monk calmed in his bodily fabrication? There is the case where a monk, with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, as with the earlier disappearance of elation and distress, enters and remains in the 4th jhana, purity of equanimity and mindfulness, neither pleasure nor pain. This is how a monk is calmed in his bodily fabrication. In other words, the purpose of step 4 is to lead the mind to the 4th jhana. As we saw above, when you're in the 4th jhana, your entire body is permeated with a pure, bright awareness. As we learn from other sutta passages, the 4th jhana is also the level of concentration where the in and out breaths stop, SN 3611 and 1072. In practice, this requires 2 stages, developing a full body awareness, as implied in the similes for the first 3 jhanas, and then getting the mind so quiet and still that there's no felt need to breathe. Step 4 focuses on the calming of the breath. If we were to follow the Visuddhimagga's interpretation of step 3, the Buddha's breath meditation instructions would be missing an important step: how to get from simply detecting the length of the breath to a full body awareness of the body not breathing in and out. But if we take the canon at its word, it doesn't say body of breath, as some translations gloss it in light of the commentary. It simply says body. Then the essential step is right there in step 3. You go from discerning whether the breath is long or short to training yourself to be sensitive to the entire body. Then in step 4 you train yourself to calm the in and out breaths so that you end up in the 4th jhana with the entire body permeated with a pure, bright awareness. This interpretation of sabaka patisamvedhi has been challenged by citing the simile that the Buddha uses to describe the first 4 steps of mindfulness of breathing when they are given in the Satipatthana and Maha Satipatthana Suttas, MN 10, DN 22. Just as a dexterous turner or his apprentice, when making a long turn, discerns, I am making a long turn, or when making a short turn discerns, I am making a short turn, in the same way the monk, when breathing in long, discerns, I am breathing in long, or breathing out long, he discerns, I am breathing out long. He trains himself, I will breathe in calming bodily fabrication. He trains himself, I will breathe out calming bodily fabrication. The turner here is a traditional version of the modern lathe worker. Videos of turners who still practice the traditional method of turning wood show that their eyes are intently focused on the point where the blade of the cutting knife meets the wood being turned. From this fact, it has been argued that the simile is making the point that, when doing these 4 steps of mindfulness of breathing, one should have an intense one-pointed focus like a turner and not be aware of the whole body. However, the videos also show that the turner has to be aware of much more than just the point where the blade of the knife meets the wood. Unlike modern lathes, where a machine turns the wood and lathe workers are responsible only for where they place the knife and with how much pressure, the traditional turner also has to turn the wood himself. He does this with a bow whose string is wrapped around the wood. So in addition to being aware of the knife, he also has to be aware of how long or short a turn he makes with the bow, which will determine how deep or shallow his cut will be. And videos of these craftsmen show that the way they use their bows is very subtle and complex. To know whether they are making a short or a long turn, the main focus of the Buddhist simile, they have to be aware of how their arms are moving the bow. In other words, the simile of the turner is actually an illustration, not of an exclusive one-pointed awareness, but of full-body awareness. Another sutta passage cited in support of the Visuddhimagga's interpretation of kaya in Sabaka Patisamvedi is the following explanation from MN 118 as to why the first 4 steps of breath meditation develop the body in and of itself as a frame of reference for establishing mindfulness. I tell you, monks, that this, the in and out breath, is classed as a body among bodies, which is why the monk on that occasion remains focused on the body in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, subduing greed and distress with reference to the world. This passage, according to the argument, defines what body means in the 3rd step of breath meditation, the in and out breath. Therefore, entire body must mean the entire temporal length of the in and out breath as felt at the nose. There are many reasons for not accepting this argument, some of which we have already cited in pointing out the general problems with the Visuddhimagga's interpretation, but here we can cite 2 more. 1. This passage from MN 118 is not offered as a definition of body in the 3rd step. Instead, it's offered as an explanation as to how all 4 of the first steps of breath meditation develop the body in and of itself as a framework for establishing mindfulness. This passage is found only in the few suttas that analyze the relationship between the 16 steps of mindfulness of breathing on the one hand and the 4 establishings of mindfulness on the other, such as MN 118 and SN 54:13. It appears in none of the many passages in the Vinaya and Suttas that list the 16 steps without reference to this relationship, such as the origin story to Pariyaka 3, SN 54-6, SN 54-8, SN 54-9, SN 54-11, and AN 1060. So the context of the explanation doesn't point to the 3rd step. But even if, for the sake of argument, we were to take this explanation as defining body in the 3rd step, the fact that it is referring to all 4 steps means we would also have to take it as defining body in the 4th step, which, as we pointed out above, would make no sense. Given that the whole compound kaya sankhara in the 4th step means the in and out breath, how could kaya in the compound also mean in and out breath? 2. Also, if we were to take kaya in sabakaya patisamvedi to mean in and out breath, why would entire in and out breath be limited to just the temporal length of the in and out breath as felt at the nose? After all, the in and out breath can be felt in many places in the body, most obviously in the shoulders, chest, diaphragm, and abdomen. Some people are so sensitive to the in and out breath that they can feel it throughout in the entire body. Given this fact, how could entire in and out breath mean only a very small part of the actual expansive in and out breathing experience? Because the first 4 steps of breath meditation aim at inducing a state in which awareness fills the body, it makes more sense to interpret Sabakaya Patisamvedi as an instruction to develop a full body awareness as you breathe in and out, param. Which brings us to the issue of param. The above discussion should be enough to indicate that the issue of which part of the body you must be focused on as you start being mindful of the breath is a total non-issue. Because you're working toward a full body awareness and right concentration, the spot where you begin should be a matter of personal choice. In fact, when we look at how the word param is used in other suttas or passages in the Vinaya, we can see that it's highly unlikely that param, in the context of meditation instructions, refers to a particular part of the body at all. This is what we find. Param appears in Kulavagga CVV 27.4, a Vinaya text, where it's listed in a passage discussing ways in which body or facial hair should not be dressed. Judging from the terms around it, it could either refer to the place where the hair grows or to the style of dressing the hair itself. The commentary to CVV 27.4 translates param in this context as chest. But because the context here is not meditation, and because the term as it stands in the canon could be interpreted in different ways, this doesn't give us much to go on. More relevant to our purposes are the many places in the suttas where param describes how mindfulness should be established when meditating. The first thing to note is that it's used not only in the context of breath meditation, but also in the context of other meditation themes. Some suttas use it to indicate that someone, the Buddha or a monk, is meditating, without reference to what his meditation theme is, as in Ud 3-4 and Ud 5-10. It's also used in contexts where the monk is described simply as abandoning hindrances, again, with no reference to the breath or any particular object of meditation, as in Dien 2, Dien 25, Mn 27, Mn 38, Mn 39, Mn 51, and many other passages. Most telling, though, are cases where someone is meditating and he cannot be understood to be consistently focusing on one particular part of the body. For example, in 364, the Buddha describes his practice of doing Brahma Vihara, sublime attitude, meditation with his mindfulness established param. Obviously, if he's extending goodwill, etc., to all beings in all directions without limit, his mindfulness can't be established exclusively on the nose tip or around the mouth, or on any other part of his body at all. Now, it might possibly be argued that the Buddha first established his mindfulness at his nose before extending goodwill, etc., to the entire cosmos, possibly, but it's by no means necessary. And even if he did start there, he couldn't have stayed there as he continued meditating. Ud 7-8 offers an example, though, where the meditating monk cannot even be construed as starting his meditation at the nose. There, then, Mahakakayana is sitting with Kayagatasati, mindfulness immersed in the body, established param within. Because this meditation involves being mindful of the entire body, then, Mahakakana's mindfulness can't be established exclusively at the nose tip or around the mouth. And because the passage refers to this whole body awareness being established param and within right from the very beginning, it's clearly not referring to a step prior to his choosing his topic of mindfulness, it's whole body and inward from the start. Because the suttas use the term param in these ways when describing the establishing of mindfulness regardless of the theme of the meditation, it seems best to regard it, at least in the context of meditation, not as a place on the body with body hair, or as a style of fashioning body hair, but as having an idiomatic meaning that would apply to all meditation practices, even those where the focus can't be on one particular part of the body. The commentaries. The commentaries themselves recognize that param cannot mean a particular part of the body when it's mentioned in the suttas in reference to meditation. The earliest commentary to discuss the meaning of param is the Patisambhidamagga, which predates Buddhaghosa's commentaries by many centuries. In fact, it is so old that the Burmese and Sri Lankans have included it in their versions of the Pali Canon. The Thais, however, seem to be more correct in regarding it as post-canonical. This text, in its discussion of mindfulness of breathing, agrees with the Vibhanga that attention, at least initially, should be focused on the breath at the tip of the nose. However, it doesn't argue this point on the basis of the word param. Instead, it offers it simply as a recommendation independent of anything in the canon. When it comes to explain param, it takes the word in an entirely different direction. Dividing param into its prefix and root, it derives what's called an edifying etymology for it, i.e., one that has less to do with the word's actual verbal roots, and more to do with the meaning the commentator wants to draw from it. Its explanation, ptis 3, 102, is this. Paratai parika hatho, mukanti niwanatho, which means, parai has the sense of parigaha, embracing, enclosing, taking up. Mukam has the sense of niyana, outlet, going out, setting forth. In other words, in this interpretation, mindfulness has been taken in hand and moved forward or out into the object. It's interesting to note that Buddhaghosa's commentary to the Vibhanga, after explaining the Vibhanga's definition of param, directs the reader to the Patisambhidamagga for a fuller explanation of the term and the topic of mindfulness of breathing in general. In other words, Buddhaghosa seems to side with the Patisambhidamagga against the Vibhanga on this point. This fact is even clearer in his commentaries on the suttas. Every time they explain the Buddha's 16-step instructions for mindfulness of breathing, or even just the first 4, they refer the reader to the full-scale treatment of the topic in the Visuddhimagga. There, Buddhaghosa explains the phrase paramukam satim upathapitva as meaning having placed or placing mindfulness facing forward to the meditation object. Paramukam satim upathapitvati equals kamathanabhimakam satim thapitva. Vism 8:161. Buddhaghosa then cites the Patisambhita Magga definition as an equally valid alternative. Here again, the quality or manner of establishing mindfulness is emphasized. It faces its object directly. The commentaries to Ud 7-8, the passage related to mindfulness immersed in the body, and N 364, the passage related to the practice of the Brahma Viharas, follow the Visuddhimagga in interpreting paramukam in this way. The commentary to Ud 7-8, for instance, which appears to postdate Buddhaghosa, defines paramukam in line with Buddhaghosa's own definition, paramukanti abhimakam, which means paramukam equals facing forward. The commentary to N 364 gives Buddhaghosa's own definition, plus the Patisambhita Magga definition as an alternative. However, it slightly tweaks the latter definition, changing parigaha, enclosing/taking up, to parigahita, taken/seized. Why the change it doesn't say. Paramukam satim upathapitvati kamathanabhimakam satim thapitva, parigahitan yanam, va katvatiyatho. Which means, having established mindfulness paramukam equals having established mindfulness facing his meditation theme or having made it parigahita niyana. The change looks minor on the surface, but the commentary to Ud 3-4 picks it up and runs with it, giving a more forceful explanation for its meaning. Parigahitan yanizatim, katvati, niwananti ca, satya ogahitabam, aramanam dathabam. Which means, niyana in the phrase, parigahitan yanizatim, katvati. This should be seen, understood, as, the object should be plunged into by mindfulness. Here again, this commentary is stating that paramukam refers not to the place in the body where mindfulness is established at the beginning of meditation, but to the manner in which it's established. In this case, the commentary is emphasizing the intensity of how it's established. You seize mindfulness and set it forth, plunging it fully into the object. The commentary to ptis 3:192, or, in the Thai reckoning, the sub-commentary to that text, shows that, at the time of its composition, many other interpretations of the Patisambhita Magga definition of paramukam had developed in the monastic community as well. This commentary's discussion of the issue is long and prolix, but here we can focus just on the meanings it offers for niyana, outlet, going out, setting forth, concentration based on mindfulness of breathing, the setting out from the wandering on, samsara, and the point of entry and exit for the in and out breaths. This last alternative is the only place in the non-Abhidhamma commentaries where the Vibhanga's definition of paramukam is even entertained, and the fact that it's last in the list of alternatives indicates that it was considered the least likely. Apart from this one exception, the commentaries seem to be unanimous in interpreting paramukam as indicating the manner with which mindfulness is established in its object, rather than the physical place where it's established. The various commentators differ in how they define that manner, but by and large the overall impression they give is one of intensity and directness. Mindfulness faces its object directly or is seized and plunged into the object. At present, one common way of trying to sort out the differences between the Abhidhamma on the one hand and the commentaries on the other is to state that, in the context of breath meditation, paramukam means at the upper lip and at the tip of the nose, and in the context of other meditation topics, it means the manner with which mindfulness is established. But this doesn't make linguistic sense, because it's part of a stock phrase used to describe meditation practice regardless of the topic of the meditation. Even when no topic is specifically mentioned, it should carry the same meaning across all mindfulness practices. If the Buddha had intended for it to mean different things in different contexts, he would have said so, yet he never did. There is one obvious argument for interpreting paramukam as meaning the tip of the nose or around the mouth in the context of breath meditation, and that's because those are the parts of the body where the flow of the air as you breathe in and out is most obvious. Literally, they're right in your face. Now, it's not wrong to focus there, but it's important to remember that the touch of the air at the tip of the nose or around the mouth is classified as a tactile contact, felt via the body in its role as one of the 6 external sense media. But when the suttas classify the in and out breath under the factors of dependent co-arising, they don't place it under the factors of sense media or contact. In MN 44, it's listed as a type of fabrication, sankhara, or intentional action. In MN 28, it's listed under the wind or energy property, which is one of the aspects of form, rupa, the body as felt from within. These facts have 3 implications. 1. Both fabrication and form are listed prior to sensory contact independent co-arising as in 12-2. This means that the contact of the air at the nostrils is conditioned by the in and out breath, i.e., it's a result of the in and out breath, and is not the in and out breath itself. So even though the flow of the air at the nostrils may, for some people, be the most obvious way of sensing the in and out breath, there's no reason to regard it as having priority over other parts of the body where the actual in and out breath can be sensed. 2. The movement of the in and out breath energy, as an aspect of form, can be felt in many parts of the body, not just at the nose. So wherever you sense the energy of the in and out breath, it's fine to begin your practice of mindfulness of breathing by focusing there. 3. The contact of the air at the nose doesn't admit of a wide range of pleasant or unpleasant feelings. However, the in and out breath as felt in other parts of the body can be extremely pleasant or unpleasant. Think of how the front of your torso feels as you breathe easily in a relaxed mood as opposed to how it feels when your breathing is labored or affected by strong anger or fear. Because mindfulness practice is meant to lead to states of jhana characterized by intense pleasure and refreshment, it makes more sense to focus special attention on the more sensitive areas of the body where the breathing process can be made very pleasurable. As noted above, because jhana is a whole-body experience, it makes no sense to insist that attention has to be focused first on a particular part of the body to the exclusion of others. Even if you do start with one point before spreading your awareness to the entire body, there's no reason to insist that it has to be the tip of the nose or around the mouth. There are people who get headaches when trying to focus there, so why force them to? For the sake of gaining the pleasure and rapture of right concentration, you can focus anywhere that you find it easiest and most pleasant to maintain focus. This is why, as I said above, the issue of which particular point in the body mindfulness should be restricted to is really a non-issue. Translating param. We're still left with the question of how best to translate param into English. Looking at how the suttas use the term, it would seem that the commentaries are right in interpreting it as describing the manner in which mindfulness is established. However, there is still one problem with the commentaries' definitions. They all describe param as indicating the manner with which mindfulness relates to its object. However, in many of the sutta passages where it appears, no object is mentioned. In some of those passages, mindfulness is used, not to connect to a meditation object, but to rid the mind of hindrances. In passages where the meditation object is mentioned, such as the in and out breath or the Brahma Viharas, the fact that the meditator establishes mindfulness param is mentioned first, and only then is there any reference to the object that the meditator focuses on. The only passage where the object is mentioned in the same phrase as the act of establishing mindfulness is Ud 7-8, where Ven. Maha Kakayana is sitting with Kayagata Sati, mindfulness immersed in the body established param within. In this special case, mindfulness and immersed in the body are part of the same compound word. But nowhere else in the canon does this particular way of using the term occur. In all other cases, the object, if mentioned at all, comes in a later sentence. This suggests that param refers metaphorically, not to the relationship between mindfulness and its object, but to its position in the mind in relation to other mental factors in preparation for applying it to the meditation object. In other words, it shows how much importance mindfulness should have. Because the term contains mukha, mouth or face, and in some contexts param could mean the chest, for a native speaker the word could easily have had connotations of something that is made prominent or placed to the forefront. This would mean that, in preparing to meditate, mindfulness is placed to the forefront of the mind and put in a position of leadership in eradicating hindrances from the mind and bringing it to concentration. For this reason, it would appear that the best translation for param would be to the forefront or to the fore. When you meditate, you establish mindfulness in the forefront of the mind, in a position of leadership among the other qualities that will engage in the meditation, and then you bring it to its object. Given that SN 4810 defines mindfulness as a faculty of the memory, one is mindful, is endowed with excellent proficiency in mindfulness, remembering and able to call to mind even things that were done and said long ago. This means that when you sit down to meditate, you establish the intention to bear in mind the instructions that you want to follow, and to remember to stay focused on your task. That's the kind of mindfulness that develops into right concentration and prepares the mind to apply its discernment to whatever is experienced in the course of concentration practice. This interpretation of param has the advantage of encouraging you to understand the importance of mindfulness in developing the mind, rather than limiting you to where you have to focus it. So for both textual and pragmatic reasons, it seems the best way to translate the word